So about 12 years ago in 2002, I had a complete physical and emotional breakdown. I ended up spending about 3 days in the hospital, just completely fell apart. For about 5 or 6 years up until that time, I'd been struggling with a really mysterious and debilitating illness that nobody could figure out. And it definitely wasn't for lack of trying. I'd flown all over the country to see doctors, various doctors and top specialists in their fields. I'd flown to a couple different countries to see specialists. I'd taken every kind of conventional drug you can think of. I'd seen alternative medicine specialists of every persuasion, acupuncturists, homeopaths, energy healers, shamans. I'd been on every special diet that you can think of. I was macrobiotic vegan for many months and vegetarian for several years. Traditional Chinese medicine healing diets. I had a cupboard full of thousands of dollars worth of supplements and herbs that I called my supplement graveyard that didn't work, didn't do anything for me. I did long meditation retreats, I did psychotherapy, I did hypnosis. I even moved to a retreat center in Big Sur called the Esalen Institute and lived there for 2 years to deeply explore the psycho-spiritual and emotional roots of my illness. And still, after all that time, at the end of that period, I was just getting sicker and sicker. And it got so bad that I couldn't work, couldn't support myself. I was broke. I had exhausted all my savings. My gut was completely wrecked. I couldn't eat anything without ending up curled in a ball in pain on the floor. I spent days in bed, not even able to get up or exercise or really even move around the house. And I was in my late 20s, so I was pretty scared. I didn't know what my future held or if I even had a future. And my primary relationship that I was in at that point fell apart. It was just a total disaster. And I reached a point where I just couldn't deal with it anymore, and I collapsed. So fast forward 12 years to today, I've not only recovered my own health, but I have a thriving private practice and online community helping other people to do the same. I have a wife and a daughter whom I adore and a life that I absolutely love living. And I have the satisfaction of helping other people who are in the same situation as me get back to the life they want to live so they can live out their dreams as well. And there's no greater satisfaction. So what happened? What took me from being barely functional, unable to support myself, completely unsure of my future, to the life that I have now? As you can imagine, it's a bit of a long story, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but the short version is that I adopted a diet and lifestyle that more closely matched what my body is designed for. See, we've known for some time that most animals that live in zoos are less healthy and live shorter lifespans than their counterparts in the wild. Why? Well, it's because their environment, primarily their diet and lifestyle in the zoo, is so dramatically different than the environment that they evolved in. Now, fortunately, some more progressive zookeepers have begun to realize this, and they're transitioning their animals back to a more native diet and lifestyle, at least to the extent that that's possible in a zoo, right? What about humans? In some ways, modern civilization has become the equivalent of animals living in captivity. You could almost say we're living in a human zoo, because our industrial civilization is unrecognizably different than the environment that humans evolved in for millions of years. You see, for 66,000 generations, which is about 2 million years, we ate primarily meat and fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants like tubers, sweet potatoes, yams, plantains, etc. We were physically active throughout the day. We didn't sit for long periods. We lived in sync with the natural rhythms of light and dark, in direct contact with the natural world, and in close-knit tribal and social groups. For example, the Ache tribe of eastern Paraguay relied primarily on game that they hunted, seasonal plant foods, palm starch, honey, and insect larvae that they collected. They were very active. They walked for an average of 6 miles per day, with brief periods of more intense physical activity when they hunted. So it might surprise you to learn that the Ache, along with virtually all other contemporary hunter-gatherer populations that have been studied, were superior to us in the industrialized world in every measure of health and fitness, from body mass index to insulin sensitivity to oxygen consumption, which is one way of measuring your physical fitness, to vision, to bone density. They were also lean and fit and pretty much free of chronic inflammatory disease, all the diseases that are killing us every year. No obesity, no diabetes, no autoimmune disease like multiple sclerosis and Hashimoto's, no allergies, no asthma, no cardiovascular disease. These pretty much didn't exist in these traditional populations. Now, some critics have argued that, sure, of course those diseases didn't exist in hunter-gatherers because they didn't live long enough to get them. I'm sure some of you have heard this critique. It's true that the average lifespan of our Paleolithic ancestors and contemporary hunter-gatherers was shorter than our average lifespan today. But these averages don't consider challenges that hunter-gatherers face that few of us in the industrialized world face today. Mostly very high rates of infant and juvenile mortality due to a complete lack of medical care. And this dragged down their average lifespan. But here's the interesting thing. Studies have shown that when hunter-gatherers have access to even the most rudimentary forms of healthcare, like having to walk for half a day to get to a rural medical clinic, they live lifespans equivalent to our own. But the difference is they reach those ages without acquiring any of the chronic inflammatory diseases that are killing us by the millions each year and destroying our quality of life. Now, contrast this with today, when 1 billion people around the world now suffer from diabetes and obesity. 600,000 people in the US die of a heart attack each year. Excess weight is now thought to account for 1 in 3 deaths that occur in middle-aged people in the US. And 50 million Americans, that's 1 in 6 people in the US, now suffer from autoimmune disease. And remember, these diseases were virtually non-existent in our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We think of them as, they're so common now we think of them as being normal, but they're absolutely not normal for human beings. Unfortunately, there's every sign that things are going to get worse before they get better. Today is the first generation of American children that are expected to lead shorter lifespan than their parents. Think about that for a moment in the entire history of this country. If current trends continue, 95% of Americans are expected to be overweight or obese in just 20 years. And 1 in 3 will have diabetes. So what happened? What took us from being a naturally lean, healthy, and vital people to being a sick, fat, and unhealthy people? In a word, the answer is mismatch. The diet and lifestyle that we're living today is at odds with our genes and our biology, and there hasn't been enough time or selective pressure for us to fully adapt to this new lifestyle. Today, the average American gets over 50% of their calories from flour, sugar, and industrially processed seed oils like corn, soybean, cottonseed, etc. We sit for long periods for work. Many of us increasingly sit during our leisure time with things like watching TV, browsing the internet and social media, playing video games. We're sleep deprived. 1/3 of Americans are now getting fewer than 6 hours of sleep, despite a mountain of evidence that suggests we need 7 to 8 hours to function properly. We're chronically stressed. The average American is working 12 to 13 hours more per week than we were just 50 years ago. And even when we do get away, we rarely unplug, right? A recent study found that 65% of American workers check their work-related email while they're on vacation. So it follows then that the way to recover our innate natural health, the health that is our birthright, really, is to return to a diet and lifestyle that more closely matches what our bodies are designed for. And that's what paleo is all about. It emphasizes the real nutrient-dense foods that our bodies thrive on, and it eliminates the highly processed and refined foods that have become the mainstay of the industrialized diet. But paleo is not just about what you eat. It's also about how you live. So getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night, managing your stress, sitting less, moving more, optimizing your sun exposure, cultivating more pleasure and connection, as several other speakers have talked about, and bringing more play into your life. These things are all just as important within the context of a paleo framework and a native species-appropriate lifestyle for promoting optimal health over the long term. So I think paleo has the potential, and the research supports this, to reverse the epidemics of metabolic and cardiovascular disease. In randomized clinical trials so far, which is the gold standard of medical evidence, paleo has shown positive improvements in weight, waist circumference, body mass index, blood pressure, blood sugar, a variety of lipid markers like total cholesterol and HDL cholesterol, and inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. What's more, paleo has been shown to be more effective for doing all of that than traditional low-fat diets and even the Mediterranean diet. It's also been shown to be more satiating per calorie than the Mediterranean and low-fat diets. What that means is that when you eat paleo foods, you feel more satisfied. When you feel more satisfied, you naturally eat less. So you lose weight without trying, and you'll be more likely to stick with it over the long term. But I've also seen the power of paleo firsthand in my work with patients, and of course in my own experience, which I told you a little bit about. One of my patients, Samantha, was about 42 when she came to see me, and she was 50 pounds overweight. She had just been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. She had several markers of impaired metabolic function, high blood sugar, high blood pressure, low HDL, high triglycerides, and a C-reactive protein of 7, which is very high, indicates significant inflammation. Of course, Sam's doctors told her she had to be on a cocktail of medications, probably for the rest of her life. And that didn't sit well with her, so she came to see me for a second opinion. After just 3.5 months on a paleo-based diet and lifestyle, she had lost 46 pounds. All of her cardiovascular and metabolic markers had returned to normal, and she felt better than she ever could remember feeling in her life. And of course, she took none of the medications that the doctor prescribed. But paleo is not just effective for metabolic problems, cardiovascular problems. It's also effective for reversing other chronic inflammatory diseases. One of my patients, Ed, had a debilitating case of ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune condition that causes inflammation in the colon and the rectum, and often severe bloody diarrhea. Things were so bad for Ed that he couldn't go out to eat, he couldn't travel, he hadn't been away from his house, really, for 10 years. And he was facing surgery. He had tried every drug they could throw at it, immunosuppressive drugs, and the next step was basically to have his colon removed. So he was desperate, and he came to me. After just 6 weeks on a paleo-based diet, a modified paleo diet, he'd gone from having 12 to 13 bloody, watery bowel movements a day to 3 mostly formed stools. And within about 6 months, he felt like a normal person again. He took his first trip overseas that he hadn't done in over 2 decades. He was able to go out to eat with friends, and he really felt like he had his life back. Now, these stories are not the exception. They're the rule. I see them all the time in my work with patients, and I hear about them regularly from my colleagues in the functional medicine community and in the paleo community. So I want to talk a little bit now about one of the most common paleo critiques. Some critics have argued that it doesn't make any sense to permanently remove foods that modern research suggests are healthy, like legumes or whole grains or even full-fat fermented dairy products, just because our ancestors didn't eat them. Now, it turns out I actually agree with this critique. It's true that our ancestors didn't eat dairy products, grains, legumes, nor did they eat dark chocolate. They didn't consume alcohol, they didn't drink green tea, they didn't drink coffee, they didn't use iPhones, they didn't fly on airplanes. So you can start to see how this argument falls apart, right? Our genes are largely the same as they were in the Paleolithic, but that doesn't mean evolution came to a full stop 10,000 years ago. In fact, researchers now know that the pace of genetic change is happening today at a rate 100 times faster than the average over 6 million years of hominid evolution, and as much as 10% of our genome shows evidence of recent selection. And these genetic changes do affect our tolerance of some agricultural foods, at least for some people, and in certain cases. Dairy products are a great example. 10,000 years ago, none of our ancestors had the ability to digest lactose as adults. With lactose as the sugar in milk, we stopped producing lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, because there was no need to produce it as adults. Mother's milk was the only lactose-containing food, And so it would have been incredibly inefficient for our bodies to continue to produce lactase into adulthood. But this all changed when cow's milk became a readily available food source. Milk was high in calcium, which our farming ancestors were deficient in, and it was also a great source of hydration and sustenance at a time when drought and famine were becoming increasingly common. So about 8,000 years ago, as often happens, a spontaneous genetic mutation arose that allowed some of our ancestors to digest lactose as adults. And what happened is this mutation spread rapidly throughout farming populations because these particular ancestors who had this mutation had a survival advantage. In times of drought and famine, they were able to nourish themselves in a way that other people weren't. So as you might expect, these mutations did spread, and today a third of the global population can digest lactose as adults. And that number is up to 95, 97% in some parts of the world that have a long history of raising dairy, like in Scandinavia. So the goal, at least in my mind with paleo, is not to recreate the exact diet that our ancestors ate. That's preposterous for a number of reasons. It's impossible to do. We don't know exactly what our ancestors ate, and it depends what ancestors you're talking about. They had different diets all over the world. The Inuit ate about 90% of their calories from fat because they lived in a really harsh Arctic environment, whereas the Tukasenta people in the Papua New Guinea highlands consume 97% of their calories from carbohydrate. They just eat sweet potatoes. And the other 3% is like the fat and protein in the insects on the sweet potatoes. And yet what these two cultures shared in common is that they were lean and fit and completely free of inflammatory disease. So what does this all mean for you? The good news is you don't have to wear a loincloth or sleep out in the backyard to get the benefits of a paleo lifestyle, although you can if you want to. Nor do you have to give up the considerable advances of modern medicine. We live in amazing times. We can restore sight to the blind. We can reattach limbs. We're starting to be able to fight cancer with nanorobots. We've even cloned animals. So why not combine the undeniable benefits of a paleo, real food, nutrient-dense diet and lifestyle with the best that modern medicine has to offer so that we can live longer and healthier lives than we've ever lived before, so that we can protect the health of future generations, which there's nothing more important than doing. And we can save billions, if not trillions of dollars a year in healthcare costs. So if you're ready to lose weight, feel better fast, and even prevent and reverse disease, here's one way that you can get started. For the next 3 weeks, just take out all flour, sugar, and industrial seed oils. These are things like corn, soybean oil, cottonseed oil. They're in a lot of processed and refined foods. These foods are really high in calories, and they're virtually devoid of the nutrients that we need to function properly. So after those 2 weeks, you remove grains, dairy products, and legumes from your diet. Now, as I mentioned, there's often nothing wrong with these foods for many people, but they're the most likely to cause problems for people who have chronic inflammatory diseases. So I think it makes sense to take them out of the diet, at least for a period of time. So once you've done that, you're on a paleo diet. Do it for another 2 weeks, for a total of 4 weeks. And at the end of that period, I think it's a great idea to reintroduce what I call gray area foods. These are these agricultural foods that we don't have a long history of eating, but that modern research has shown are healthy when they're well tolerated. So we're talking about whole grains, talking about legumes, which are fantastic for the gut microbiome. We're talking about alcohol. We're talking about full fat and fermented dairy products. So these are things that you can add back in to see how you tolerate. Because as any clinician in this room will tell you, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to diet. We share a lot in common as human beings, but we also have important differences. We have different genes, different gene expression, different lifestyles, different goals, different activity levels, and all of these will influence and determine what an optimal diet and lifestyle is for each one of us. So we start with paleo foods because they're the most nutrient-dense, they're anti-inflammatory, they are safe for most of us, and they're the least likely to cause food intolerance or food allergy reactions. But there's no reason to completely exclude these agricultural foods from your diet forever just because our ancestors didn't eat them. So with rates of obesity and chronic disease at all-time highs and healthcare costs continuing to spiral out of control, I think there's never been a greater need for a low-cost, effective solution to this healthcare crisis we're in. I believe a paleo-based diet and lifestyle has the potential to dramatically improve our health, to protect the health of future generations, to prevent and reverse disease, and save us billions, if not trillions of dollars in healthcare costs each year. But you don't have to wait around for the mainstream authorities to see the light. You can be part of this change right now by taking charge of your own health. And if we all did that, the world would be a much healthier and wealthier place. Thanks for listening.